Good evening, and welcome to tonight's Freedom Forum salute to Al Neuharth, Diversity and the First Amendment. I'm Gene Policinski, Freedom Forum Senior Fellow for the First Amendment and President and Chief Operating Officer of the Freedom Forum Institute. Tonight's program is prompted by a special recognition of Al's life, the Library of Congress adding his papers to its collection. It's also prompted by a special moment for many of us and for the nation, the 38th anniversary of the September 15th, 1982 launch of USA Today. And then there's this nation's renewed attention in the past months to diversity, inclusion, and social justice, which gives us cause to celebrate Al's unique and early commitment to those values, which he put in place throughout his career at Gannett and USA Today and at the Newseum and the Freedom Forum. We'll hear later tonight from those who knew him personally, professionally, and more recently through his papers. We'll hear from the CEO and chair of the Freedom Forum and Al's daughter, Jan Neuharth. From Ryan Reft, a historian at the Library of Congress and curator of the Al Neuharth collection. And from esteemed journalist and author Wanda Lloyd, whose awareness of Al's commitment to increasing the newsroom presence of women and people of color came well before she worked as an editor at USA Today and later during her time with the Freedom Forum's Diversity Institute. We'll hear tonight about Al's legacy, a life with impact and presence in his years, but also one with a lasting effect on journalism in this nation, not just in the format in which news is presented, but even more significantly through the increased diversity of the people who present it. Let me now introduce the chair and chief executive officer of the Freedom Forum, lawyer and author, and the person who knew Al as both news media executive and as a parent, Jan Neuharth.
Thank you, Gene, and welcome to all of you who have joined us tonight as we celebrate Al for his many accomplishments. As a revolutionary media executive whose vision for USA Today included not only colorful newsprint, but a diverse newsroom staff that reflected the nation it served. As the founder of the Freedom Forum and the driving force behind our mission to foster First Amendment freedoms for all. As a trailblazer who dreamed big and had the courage to follow his dreams, but who also had the resilience and free spirit to shake off failure and reach for the stars. Al was a fierce advocate for a free and fair press, and he was decades ahead of his time in promoting women and people of color into top leadership positions. Al led the news industry in adopting the view that it was both good business and good journalism for newsrooms to reflect the diversity of the audiences they serve. Let's watch a brief video about Al's career and his commitment to the First Amendment and diversity, inclusion, and opportunity for all.
Well, Al Neuharth thought big. He did big, someone who took risks. He was a free spirit, and he was deeply dedicated to serving the public good through free expression. He was the essence of the First Amendment.
It's just a true American dream and story of perseverance.
As this young boy growing up in South Dakota poor, his first career move was a failure.
Sodak Sports, my first venture in entrepreneurship, we were belly up after 2 years.
Once you picked yourself up off the floor, it's not too tough after that to take a risk because you know you've survived one, and so you're less reluctant to do it again.
And I think that's why he was willing to take the risk with USA Today.
The nation's newest newspaper made its debut in the Washington area Wednesday.
He felt that USA Today could connect the country in a way that had never been connected before.
One of the things that Al did was kind of almost have a Star Wars atmosphere as it related to USA Today, and we were the Jedi Knights expanding the newspaper empire.
They're encouraged to take risks, and if they fail in taking a pretty well-calculated risk, so be it. Move on to something else.
And so I think that they worked very hard, but they knew they had a boss, a leader, a mentor in Al that completely believed in them.
There was a lot of criticism early on. There's still criticism now. I still see it every day.
We were called big paper, we were called the fast food of journalism. And I said to the newsroom staff, look, this is great, we're getting attention. Doesn't matter that it's not complimentary.
They had the ability to come in and recreate journalism and turn it upside down from the conventional way it had always been done. That meant a lot to him, and so I think he was really, really proud of that.
He he never gave up. He knew it was going to work, and it did, and here we are 37 years later, and it's still working.
Staffing USA Today from scratch offered a unique opportunity to prove that a diverse workforce could indeed be built and that it would work just fine.
So Al, to his core, believed in equality for all people. His dad died when he was 2, so his mom raised them.
That really instilled in him a sense of equality. He saw his mom working really hard to support him and his brother and earning less than men who were doing the same work.
That burned in his heart through his whole life.
My style is not to attract people like myself. My style is to attract a good mix of men and women with diversified backgrounds and interests and philosophies.
If you are building the nation's newspaper, you want it to reflect the nation.
You can't properly serve the community that you're reporting on the news to if you have white men, making the editorial decisions.
And there was a lot of lip service of newspaper companies that they wanted to be more diversity, but can't find anybody qualified. And with him, there was no but. And so we're going to do it.
When I first started, I was at awe at the number of women that were at the top levels within Gannett and USA Today, like Madeline Jennings.
I was involved in introducing a new appraisal system for the managers. That involved profit, product, and people. And the people part included diversity. It was a major change in the way we operated Gannett.
He dipped into pools where there was talent that had not been utilized fully. Women. Well, let's get them into the publishers' ranks. First African Americans, Latinos, and Asians.
And you'd be amazed at the progress that we made. By the mid-'80s, we were much more diverse than we had been at the beginning. And our earnings per share went up every quarter.
Al was known for wanting to educate young adults.
He'd been given a chance in his career by mentors, and so he said, I would like you to name a journalism conference after me.
It's selecting the best kids in the country, try to just help shape these young lives for these people to make a difference. Like he said, this Free Spirit program is his legacy.
I just think I'm as lucky as I could possibly have been to have spent 50 years in journalism and to have had the opportunities I've had and to have things go right more than they went wrong. It's been a great fun, great ride.
He lived life to the fullest.
He dreamed of big things. They dared him to do it, and he did it. He was always someone reaching out for more, and I love that about him.
He didn't tell people what to do. He told them what he expected of them and created an environment and opportunities for them to succeed.
Whether it's the way you ran the newspapers, whether it's the impact of the Freedom Forum, keep your eye on the long-term goal of what you'd like to achieve.
He was powerful and he was positive. He's someone to admire.
A free spirit can help us get the most out of life at any age and under any circumstances. We simply must dream and dare and do.
That terrific video was produced in 2019. Since that time, thousands have used their First Amendment freedoms to make their voices heard about police brutality and the shooting deaths of Black men and women. Diversity, inclusion, and racial equity are part of our DNA here at the Freedom Forum, with long-standing programs like the CHIPS Quinn Scholars, the Al Neuharth Free Spirit and Journalism Conference, and the PowerShift Project. In the spirit of Al, in recent weeks, we have explored and will continue to explore what role the Freedom Forum can play in the current nationwide reckoning on racial injustice. Here's some of what we have done. Our PowerShift Project's workplace integrity training has hosted more than 1,200 people for online webinars focused on guiding people of privilege who want to do more to fight inequity and be better advocates for change. We produced a series of programs and columns on how the First Amendment was and is being used in pursuit of racial justice. And we launched an educational and social media initiative about the power of assembly in advance of the March on Washington last month. Internally, we have created a new diversity and inclusion task force to make sure we are living up to our ideals. Speaking of ideals, few institutions better record and reflect our nation's ideals than the Library of Congress. Al considered it an honor to donate his papers to the library, where they could be explored by generations to come, studying the history of journalism and the media. In just a moment, you'll hear from Ryan Reft, a curator of the Al Neuharth collection at the Library of Congress. Ryan will speak to us about some of the signature artifacts in the collection and what they reveal about Al. But before I turn it over to Ryan, I want to mention that the curatorial process began before Al's papers were delivered to the Library of Congress. And I'd like to give a special word of thanks to Al's longtime executive assistant, Suzette Corellis, whom Al entrusted with organizing his papers for presentation to the library after his passing. Suzette spent over a year sorting through file rooms of documents and mementos that spanned 7 decades and ultimately handed over 103 file boxes to the Library of Congress that resulted in the Al Neuharth collection we are going to preview tonight. So let's get started. Ryan, I'll turn it over to you.
Good evening, Jen, and thank you for that introduction. I am Ryan Reft. I am a historian in the Manuscript Division at the Library of Congress. I focus on 20th century American history, which is why I'm speaking to you today about Al Neuharth. I oversee our pretty robust journalism collections in the division. So I'm going to share the screen with you now and talk to you about what the library does, how these papers come to, well, not specifically, but how papers come to us, and then tell you the story of Al Neuharth through his collection. So, you know, as I took the title from his own memoir, Confessions of an SOB at the LOC, the Al Neuharth papers. How do papers like that come to the library, and what do we collect? Why do we collect them? Well, we tend to focus on people who have, individuals who have a national impact or took part in a historical event. Doesn't necessarily have to be the person at the center of the event, although it could be. Could be someone who simply covered the event or has items or materials that tell us a unique perspective about the said event. It also depends on the collection, how it speaks to our other collections, how it speaks to what we think might be the future of our collections, and if it fills blind spots, perspectives that we don't have in the collections currently. The process tends to fall into one of 3 categories. It doesn't always fall into these 3 categories, but I'd say it's between 75 to 90% of the time it does. And so papers come to us one of 3 ways. One, the individual will, or the organization, though we do not collect organizational papers like we used to, will come to us and say, hey, look, I was a part of this thing or these things. I have these papers. I think they might be worth collecting historically. In another example, we might target individuals. This happens with like Supreme Court justices, for example. And we might reach out to them and say, hey, we'd like to see what you have, what kind of papers you have. Do you have journals? Do you have notes? Do you have printed matter that reflects the era? Things like that. And finally, the other way, and this is less common but not unusual, basically someone might pass. They do not make a plan for their papers, and the family either approaches us or we see an obituary and we approach the family. In any of these scenarios, the specialist who oversees that era or that particular thematic historical period will go look at the papers, determine if they are appropriate, and if they are appropriate, then kind of look through them to see what we want and what we don't want. Like, we don't really want plaques and objects. That's better for the Smithsonian. But in terms of like material culture things, we do want them. Why do we collect? Well, one, we do think history matters at the library. Obviously, we think we are the world's largest library and one of the world's largest archives, particularly in terms of American history. And in an era of disinformation, we think it's valuable that there is public access to this history, be it through our online programming or through in-person visits when we reopen for exhibits such as Shall Not Be Denied, the women's suffrage exhibit currently on display, or the Rosa Parks in Her Words, another exhibit on display. And all our exhibits are available virtually as well. And in speaking to Neuharth specifically, I would say that we have a robust collection of journalists. Anthony Lewis from the New York Times, David Broder from the Washington Post, Kay Graham, whose papers don't open up for another decade, but we have them, Meg Greenfield. Mr. Neuharth would fit right into that story, and considering the just rapid change that has unfolded due to the internet and other factors in media, there's a future exhibition, hopefully one day, that will appear and maybe even use Mr. Neuharth's papers as a part of it. Now, how research uses the papers, there's the obvious way. High school students might come and write a term paper, though high school students are less common. Undergrads, same thing for a seminar paper. Graduate students for theses and dissertations. Academic historians from universities for their own work. Popular historians like David McCullough and others who will use it. Writers of fiction might use our collections to basically gauge how people talked in an era, or look at how an individual who they might be basing a book on acted. Also, I think one of the more interesting aspects is film. Now, documentarians are obvious why they might come and use this, but we also get producers of feature films now and then, because let's say you're doing a film on the 1970s in the Washington Post. You might want to see the material culture of the Post. What kind of stationery did they use? How did they speak to each other? Look at the photos to see how they dressed or maybe carried themselves. So these are just a couple of the ways researchers use the papers, and sometimes in ways you may not expect. But let's dive into the papers now with Alan Neuharth to see how his papers tell the story of his life, and in some ways the life of media from basically the 1960s to today. So right there you see there's a 5th anniversary party, Mr. Neuharth blowing out the candles of a giant cake. I'm just going to quickly run through a brief bio of him. Obviously born into Depression era South Dakota, gets his first gig as working in the newspaper industry as a newspaper boy delivering newspapers. 1950, after serving in the war, earns a position as a reporter with the AP at $10 a week, eventually moves on to the Miami Herald, the Detroit Free Press, and then lands again in 1963 as general manager, rising to chairman in 73, where his tenure lasts from 1973 to 1989. During that period, they go from, I think, profits of upper 300 million to 3.3 billion. They go from a Northeast regional newspaper chain to basically a media conglomerate with, I believe, 10 television and 16 radio stations, in addition to one of the largest newspaper chains in the nation. So, and obviously establishes USA Today as well, a major newspaper in its own right today. Now, it's worth noting that he had his critics, Ben Bradley among them, which we'll talk about in a minute through the materials. And there were those who said that he paid too much attention to profits on Wall Street over public service, or perhaps, championing cost-cutting measures over quality. And some would even say that USA Today was too much like television news and that it dumbed down the news. Now, however, there are also people who say, look, those criticisms missed the mark. Because the fact is the internet was coming for media, and a lot of the reforms that occurred under Neuharth's tenure saved these kind of newspapers like USA Today and others, emulated them. And Neuharth himself even told reporters once, USA Today has had a tremendous impact on newspapers for better or for worse, and in some cases it has been for worse. There are some things some papers have been foolish to adopt. The larger point being, there's a lot of nuance when you're discussing the growth of media, particularly at the end of the 20th, 21st century. It's hard to blame one entity for anything, and Neuharth can be also credited for improving the lot of newspapers as well. So the story is much more complicated than some of the critics might have argued. Now, what to say about Neuharth? Well, we all know that his management style, as described in his memoir, came down to this. Some people are motivated by a pat on the back, others respond better to a kick in the ass. And in this letter from Alan Neuharth to Jack Gallagher, who was managing the corporate jet at the time, an idea that came from Neuharth himself, if you look at the second and third paragraph, you kind of get at both the attention to detail and his management style. No one is regularly checking on the supplies to make sure they are in order. For example, on the latest trip, there is no razor with which a man can shave unless he wants to use an electric razor. I don't. There's no shaving cream. There's no aftershave lotion. On the other hand, there are a dozen or more cases of deodorant, which leads me to conclude whoever is checking the supplies doesn't shave or has a bad case of BO. In any case, both his sense of humor comes out of there, kind of the sharp elbows, but also his attention to detail, because he basically concludes ultimately that, look, you need to pay attention to the departments in the back as much as to the cockpit and the crew. This jet is not just for transportation. It's also kind of emblematic of our ideals as an organization. Now, the other point about Alan Neuharth that definitely deserves mentioning is that the fact that, today Me Too is a common hashtag and it's a laudable movement, but in 1978 it wasn't so common, and yet from the earliest days at Gannett through USA Today and the end, he was at the forefront of improving diversity in the newsroom. If you look at the second paragraph here from Don Graham, who was managing the Washington Post, a competitor at the time. I read in a recent editor and publisher that Gannett has promoted yet another woman to publisher and has also promoted a woman to managing editor of one of your newspapers. I've heard for years that yours is one newspaper company that generally has an affirmative action program and means what it says on this issue. Within 10 years of this letter, in fact, Gannett's proportion of minorities in its newsrooms was nearly 50% higher than the national average. 40% of its managers, professionals, technicians, and sales agents were women, as were a quarter of its publishers. Again, this is 30 years before the Me Too era, and these are numbers that today many corporations would envy. Now, speaking of the Washington Post and competition, I think this is a great picture of Kay Graham and Alan Neuharth right here. This is at the 1979 American Newspaper Publishers Association conference in Atlanta. You get a sense of both their shared camaraderie. They did compete fiercely at times, which we'll see in a second, but also Mr. Neuharth's sense of style, his kind of bon vivant persona in this photo. And to the point I made secondarily, in terms of their competition, both Graham and Neuharth did sometimes upset each other in terms of competing for talent and for business. And yet there's a warmth there. Look at the third paragraph in this May 1st, 1982 letter. Now that we have both let down our guard for 5 minutes, we can safely go back to the tough shiv. And I have got my eye on you about your intentions with USA Today and our fair city, to say nothing about the hires you are making from our midst. So she clearly is conveying the idea that she understands there's competition, but when you look at the last paragraph, there's also still this warmth there. Please remember, I would like to know from time to time when you are in town and have a few extra moments for lunch or dinner or in between. Affectionately, Kay. It's also worth noting in a letter that she wrote to him about a year earlier, a little more cryptic, but pretty entertaining. I loved my night in the town with Neuharth, or my course on breaking and entering 105, whichever you prefer. I have no idea what she's referring to there, but I guess the larger point is he competed fiercely with the Washington Post and Kay Graham, and yet at the same time, his ability to communicate with people on a human level was there on a very real thing. Now, when Alan Neuharth died, his 2013 obituary in the New York Times described him as, quote, flamboyant, egotistical, and proudly Machiavellian. He dressed in, quote, designer finery, and he was more rat pack than rumpled newspaper man. An individual who, quote, relished the role of larger-than-life tycoon. I think this photo from the Pumpkin Center from a party in 1981 kind of conveys all those things. You see the era-appropriate amber aviator sunglasses, and he's kind of the close-talking, very influential position that he has there. It's worth noting the Pumpkin Center itself played a multi-purpose role. It was a site of leisure for him and for his friends. It was a site of networking and parties such as this one. It was also a site of business. And I think that this letter from Tom Brokaw, I think 1983, because he references Sally Ride in this letter, kind of illustrates all three of those at once. And I know it's written there, but I'll read it for you just to kind of give you a sense of this. Again, thanks for all the hospitality, especially the plane ride. It's at least 2 cuts above the middle seat in the shuttle. I suspect you'll be rid of us for a while. We'll cut back coverage until Sally's ride and landing back at the Cape. As for the rest of the weekend, I hope I didn't contaminate your tennis court for long. So first paragraph, you get the kind of collegiality and thanks for the shuttle, thanks for the ride. The second paragraph, you get a little media business. And the third paragraph, you get the leisure. Hey, we've been playing tennis, which apparently was super popular in the 80s because from my work in the division, a lot of big name people are playing tennis. So take that for what it's worth. Here you have the Pumpkin Center the planning for USA Today, I think probably around 1980, 1981, back when it was under the pseudonym NN. And you also see the photo, on the wall, you can see the 3 TVs, so this kind of mix of the media center, and they're having work, they're planning this. You also see the little robot there in front of Neuharth at the head of the table. That was kind of this little mascot that they adopted as a promotional device for the rollout. I thought was kind of neat, ultimately. So this is the souvenir copy of USA Today. This is a couple weeks before they kind of run their official copies. This is like August. I just draw your attention to the cover story underneath the picture of Neuharth there, with a nod to tradition and an eye on history. The reason I bring that up is because USA Today is the only major newspaper established after World War II. When you think about the LA Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, these are more august newspapers. They've been around a longer period of time. He was under no illusions about how difficult a job it was going to be to establish another major newspaper. And yet, successfully did so, even if it didn't turn a profit for the first couple of years, I think until the early 90s. But this souvenir, I think, edition kind of gets at that challenge that was awaiting them as they move forward. Now, a couple years later, you have, this is a advertisement for the Gannett newspaper, the 4-color newspaper network. Now, I think what's valuable about this is that it once gets at, it illustrates some of the criticisms that people had, but also the things they emulated. So 18 million readers by 1985 for the Gannett network of newspapers. I think USA Today by this time is about 1.3 million annually. So they're making strides. You see the bright colors, the maps, the short declarative statements, which is some of the things that people both criticized and emulated for USA Today. And in fact, I think the common critique that people were lobbying at the time were the Mick paper. But internally, and this is a reflection of Neuharth's own, I think, embrace of humor and self-deprecation, whenever another newspaper or media outlet adopted one of their techniques, USA Today's techniques or Gannett's techniques, they called it stealing our McNuggets. So they, while on the one hand probably didn't appreciate the moniker McPaper, they also had a sense of humor about it. And the reason I say that is to bring you to the next slide, which basically the Harvard Lampoon edition in 1986. Harvard Lampoon, obviously a famous comedy outlet from Harvard. Basically, in 1980s, creates about 750,000 copies of this satirical version of USA Today. We see under it says 200 years of serving our readers. You see the people at the bottom in the watching USA Today almost like it was a television. And you see the headlines, Mondale demands recount, which is pretty funny for people of a certain age, but only for people of a certain age. And if you move further to the right under lifestyle, see at the very bottom, Linda Blair still turning heads. That's also kind of funny. I think the important point here is twofold. One, Neuharth understood the value of self-deprecation in advertising and knew that, look, they might be mocking us a little bit here, but if you can laugh at yourself, you can laugh at yourself all the way to the bank. In the sense that now you're going to have 750,000 of these copies circulated on college campuses, and you're opening basically a market to 18 to 34-year-olds who maybe aren't reading your newspaper right now, and you do it in a way that's self-deprecating, which today is basically a campaign strategy for many, many advertising campaigns moving forward. So he was not only prescient in the idea of USA Today, prescient in the idea of minority hiring and diversity hiring. He's also prescient in the idea of how to advertise and reach consumers. Now he steps down in 1989 from at his tenure, which had begun in 1973. But before that, he was, subsequently criticized by Ben Bradley. Ben Bradley, of course, has his own aura about him. But these two men would frequently trade barbs now and then. For example, in an earlier kind of exchange, I think Bradley had said basically, if USA Today is a good newspaper, then I'm in the wrong business. And Neuharth shot back, Bradley and I finally agree on something. He is in the wrong business. We actually have that correspondence in the collection, but I actually wanted to highlight this one instead. This is from October 1978, and Bradley had gone out to the West Coast and given a talk in which he kind of disparaged chain newspapers. And this is, I'm going to read the whole letter. It's not that long, but it kind of gets at their relationship. As you know, I have never been critical of the BBB, the Ben Bradley bullshit you spread around Washington, D.C., because I realize it goes with the territory. But it's quite a different matter when you start peddling your pap out in the heartland of America like Wilmette, Oregon. It's not that there's any danger of the folks out there taking you seriously, but words spoken ever so jestfully in the most remote places work their way into print. Filter back east, and first thing you know, even the usually discerning intellectual giants among the Potomac may put some faith in what you said because of where you said it. Since none of us would want that to happen, I respectfully urge you to either clean up your act or take it off the road. Now, to Bradley's credit, and we have this correspondence in the collection also, he writes back, he agrees to take it off the road, but also says, I am not anti-chain, I am anti-mediocrity. As for BBB, it takes one to know one, doesn't it? And I think here, this is the epitome of game recognizing game. These are two ambitious, driven men, editors, publishers, who understand that this is a hard business and you got to compete. I don't know how friendly they were personally. I think they might have been what we call frenemies, but nonetheless, I think they both recognized that each was a competent and formidable foe and opponent in the media sphere. Now, in '89, he steps down, and this is when you get the Freedom Forum, which obviously many of you are here for. The Freedom Forum promotes issues concerning the First Amendment and diversity hiring in newsrooms. I think that I have two letters here that kind of illustrate the breadth of the kind of people he was engaging through the Freedom Forum, particularly in the media world. So the first one is from the Dean of Broadcast Journalists, Walter Cronkite. He regrets not being able to come to the last couple meetings due to his busy lecture schedule, but quote, "I missed those very important meetings, which I feel are so productive in bringing the cases for and against modern journalism to the table." At the moment he was recovering from a torn Achilles tendon in his right leg, probably from playing tennis, as per usual. But nonetheless, this is a testament to Neuharth's influence that Walter Cronkite is someone who's engaging the Freedom Forum on a very fundamental level. Now, by 2003, the University of South Dakota had built the Al Neuharth Media Center, and so we're going to bring it full circle here with Katie Couric. She is the recipient in 2009 of Excellence in Media Award, so this speaks to both his ability to speak to modern and at the time current broadcasters, but also his attention to diversity in this industry. So, she talks about the event that happened there in South Dakota, and she brings a real local flavor when you look at the last two paragraphs. I also appreciate the hometown cooking at Wimp's, fried cheese curdles, all-you-can-eat spaghetti for $4.95. I certainly will not forget that stop. Most of all, I want to thank you for your kind words and support. It means so much to me to have you in your corner. So I will finish with this. And this photo is from the same party we started with, and I think it kind of embodies many of the things we talked about. He's a man who's prescient in a number of areas in terms of diversity hiring, how to kind of cost cut and keep newspapers competitive, and also kind of how to carry yourself in a crowd and remain basically the center of the story. So here you see him dressed well as always, larger than life, but also self-deprecating enough that you see his midriff there just caked with cake. And he's clearly having a good time, which I think ultimately Neuharth's life was about in that way. Dedicated to the industry, but also not arrogant enough to not see the funny parts about it as well. And with that, I want to wish you the best this evening. Come by the library to check out the Al Neuharth papers, and good luck with the Freedom Forum.
Thanks, Ryan. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Wanda Lloyd, a former colleague, a longtime friend, and a national leader on issues of race, diversity, and leadership in the news media. A Savannah, Georgia native, her career as an editor spans 7 daily newspapers, including USA Today, The Washington Post, and the Montgomery Advertiser. She later returned to Georgia to become department chair and associate professor in the Department of Journalism and Mass Communications at Savannah State University. Most recently, Wanda is the author of an inspiring memoir, Coming Full Circle, From Jim Crow to Journalism, published last February. Wanda.
Thank you, Gene, for that introduction. It's always good to reconnect with you as one of my former USA Today colleagues. When I was a mid-level editor in the late 1970s at the Washington Post, we started hearing rumblings about the new national newspaper that was being created by the Gannett Company, a group of newspapers that frankly was not all that familiar to me in the mid to late 1970s. Around the same time, since NABJ, the National Association of Black Journalists, was founded in 1975, I started to meet and read about NABJ founders, and some of them were talking about Gannett, the growing company then based in Rochester, New York. By the early 80s, Gannett was floating prototypes of USA Today, sending them to newsrooms across the industry, I suppose, getting feedback from journalists about this upcoming newspaper with short stories, color photographs, infographics that popped off the pages, and best of all, positive stories about people who looked like me, African Americans and women. By then, I had worked in newsrooms for 10 years, but I had never seen a newspaper that looked like USA Today. Despite the naysayers in the Washington Post newsroom, from the top on down, I listened with a keen ear about the founder of USA Today, this man named Al Neuharth. I offer 3 things I particularly remember about Al. First, from my perch in the Post newsroom, I noticed that every time I would read when Al was quoted in a speech or an interview, no matter the subject, whether it was about news topics, marketing, advertising revenue, the cost of newsprint, the amount of ink being used in newspapers, anything, he always mentioned the importance of diversity in staffing across all levels of the organization and diversity in content. He and other top Gannett executives positioned the company as one that held top managers responsible for diversity. So 4 years after the founding of USA Today, in 1986, I had an opportunity to accept a position as a deputy managing editor at the still new newspaper. Second, one of Al's well-known quotes comes to mind. "Never hesitate to steal a good idea," he said. I remember him as a visionary, someone who would take an idea and empower people to think outside the box. Don't say, "We can't do that because it's never been done." He empowered us to think, how can we get this done? And then let's do it. And third, I remember him saying, "You've got to spend money to make money." That's why when I became a top editor and the newsroom administration leader at USA Today, I admired the fact that we could go find the best talent and pay them competitively, that we could send our reporters and photographers to cover all of the important stories and major events around the world, and that we worked in a comfortable environment that helped me look forward to going to work every day. I also appreciate Al Neuharth's devotion to programs supporting the First Amendment and diversity in newsrooms, even beyond Gannett properties. Through the Freedom Forum, I was delighted to support some of those programs that later came out of the foundation. To me, that's Al Neuharth's legacy. The many journalists who benefited, the Chips Quinn Scholars, APME Fellows, the Diversity Institute graduates, women in leadership roles, and so much more. Al Neuharth's constant reminders spoke to the very core of my own belief that newsroom diversity is a way to ensure that journalists report with accuracy.
Thank you, Wanda. Your work echoes throughout journalism and inspires us all, not just journalists, who care about our nation living up to the promises and opportunities for success and achievement that it made to all of its citizens. You know, in a recent First Five column about the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Justice, I took note of Al's directive from day one at USA Today that there would be a woman and a person of color among the photos each day on each section front. It was a policy with a goal of diversifying not just those days' pages, but also as reporters' sources, and not incidentally, the nation's image of itself. Later, there were more moments with Al at the Freedom Forum, where we could see in practice on a daily basis his emphasis on diversity, on a free and fair press, and on bringing about a new appreciation in our fellow citizens for the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment. As you have seen tonight, Al's legacy and leadership continue to guide and inspire, as will his papers at the Library of Congress for future generations, and as does the Freedom Forum that he founded, with its ongoing work in fostering First Amendment freedoms for all. At the Freedom Forum, we have faced up in many ways to the challenges of not just continuing that work in difficult economic and social times, but also finding new ways to educate, inform, and engage our fellow citizens about those crucial 5 freedoms. If you would like to join us in carrying on that effort of fostering First Amendment freedoms for all, or just to learn more about our work, please visit us at freedomforum.org. That's freedomforum.org. Thanks for being with us tonight and in supporting our First Amendment work wherever and however you can. Good night.